So welcome once again to this ABHI web and podcast. It's one of the series I've been doing in conversation with system leaders across the country. And today we're heading as far south and as far as west as it's possible to do in the UK. I'm delighted to be joined by Phil Confue, who is the Chief Executive of the Cornwall NHS Partnership, Cornwall Partnership NHS Foundation Trust, which we both have problems saying that this morning already, Phil, haven't we? Phil's also been the Senior Responsible Officer for the Cornwall STP and is leading the transition of that into the integrated care system, which is the main reason we're going to talk to Phil today. Phil, before we do that, just say a few words about your trust and your day job, the range of services you're doing, and it'll be interesting that the folks heard a couple of weeks ago from your opposite number in Cambridge and Peterborough, Tracy Dowling. So just a few words on your trust will be helpful, Phil.
Yeah. So hello everyone. So Cornwall Partnership NHS Foundation Trust, we cover mental health and community services in Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly, which is probably the only island state within England. Scotland have lots of them, but we've convinced the Department of Health that Scilly counts as an island and should be treated separately. But yeah, so we provide all the mental health services that you'd expect, up to low secure services. We have PICU, crisis services, community services, IAPT, the improving access to psychological therapies, as well as the full range of community services that would include things like the community hospitals, district nursing, specialist community terms, end of life services, all of those services for adults, older people, and for mental health for children as well. So a full range of community services. Almost at times I describe it as, if it's not the acute hospital in Cornwall, then it's run by the trust, and that's what we provide in terms of the services. So that's where we're at and what we provide really across Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly.
Great, thanks, Phil. That's helpful. And then just a word before we kind of get into the integrated care bit. I think people are interested on these about how each area went into COVID and their COVID story and the response. And there'll be a few second homeowners listening to this. Doubtless a few people who've got vouchers from Cornwall Cottage Holidays to redeem at some point when it's possible. And I think people saw a lot in the media about the county, about how welcome visitors were or not throughout this. And how the county responded. Be really interested. Many of the discussions we've had recently have been with system leaders from large urban areas. So I'm speaking to you this morning from Birmingham. Very, very large ICU, 100-bed ICU, University Hospital Birmingham. You're almost at the other end of the scale down in Cornwall. I think 15 ICU beds as reported was all you had in Trellis. So maybe just some thoughts on what the COVID journey has been like in the county, how you prepared for it, how you went into it, and what recovery might start to look like in the months ahead.
Okay, so in terms of COVID, we started sort of last year as we went into the original spikes with the same sort of predictions that everyone was looking at, which was death and destruction, really, that the world was going to end if we weren't careful. And we laid our plans as we prepared for lockdown to take that through. I think our dispersal rate, our population sort of per head of population in Cornwall is much lower than elsewhere. So actually, as a consequence, our transmission rate has been much lower. So we've generally been about half of the national average in terms of COVID rates. Now that still means we have to follow through all of the rules that go through, all of the concerns that go through, all the PPE, all the social distancing. But actually, we've not had those high infection levels. And actually, until very recently, we'd had no outbreaks on the Isles of Scilly whatsoever. So we'd had some areas that were totally green for large periods of time on that. So there's clearly something about the dispersed geography of Cornwall has protected us that we've seen in some of the bigger urban centres hasn't been worked for them quite so well. But also, I suppose, in terms of our model of care, because we have a large number of community hospitals, we've been less reliant on the acute hospitals to necessarily deal with the COVID cases and more reliant on a dispersed model. And that's had a really positive impact for our acute providers, particularly in RCHT, it's meant that in a way we've been able to head off quite a lot of nosocomial infection by having people who, if you're not on high flow oxygen, then really you're being looked after in a small community hospital where it's easier to manage the infection and easier to manage the IPC controls than if you've got everybody concentrated in an acute hospital, where with a little bit of spread and a little bit of nosocomial infection, you can lose large amounts of your workforce and large amounts of your hospital. So there are generally a time where we've had points where we've had more, as a community mental health provider, we've had more COVID cases than our acute colleagues. And generally, even at peaks, we've been at about a 50-50 rate. So we have managed it in a very different way, and a flow out from the hospital rather than everything going into an acute centre. Our nearest Nightingale development was Exeter. Really, that's not really appropriate for us. That's 120 miles away for most people in Cornwall. That's not a distance you're going to travel. It would be like me saying to you, Richard, it's okay if you get COVID, we'll send you to London from Birmingham. That would seem reasonable. So it's not we've not had an option other than to be self-sufficient in that respect. But I think our model of using community hospitals, we've supported virtual wards as other areas have done, have really meant that in a sense we've kept our COVID rate down, and we've managed to keep it dispersed. We've also invested heavily in supporting our care home sector. So we're providing nursing staff to work in care homes, residential homes, to keep them tipping over, keep them running, because obviously if a care home tips over, that's 30 or 40 acute beds that potentially could suddenly be filled up with care home residents. So again, we've had that mix of, let's keep everything in the community where we can, support people in a different environment, and the last place we want people to go is the acute sector, unless you really need that intensive care. As you say, we've normally got 15 intensive care beds in RCHT and Truro, our acute colleagues. We have expanded that up, and I think at the peak we had sort of 20 beds full, but we've managed to stay really within the capacity that we've got. We could have expanded up to 30 and beyond, but we've not needed that. So I think we've had successive low COVID rates, and I think an element of that is our geography has meant that the spread has been less, and we've seen sort of the hinterland of Cornwall around Saltash that borders onto Plymouth has had some very high COVID rates. But as you move further into the rural county, we've not had the rates spread quite so high. And also our model of using community hospitals to look after people in the community rather than have them in the acute sector has meant that we've reduced nosocomial infection, and we've managed to keep more people safe and keep more services open and running. So I think that's really where we've got to with COVID. Obviously, like everybody, we're now in full flow for vaccination, and I think across the NHS, it's an amazing feat that actually we're getting the vaccinations running the way we are. Everybody's getting vaccinated. We're into tier 6 now of the JCVI codings. So that's really, really positive in terms of where we're getting. We've got a number of mass vaccination sites up and running in Cornwall again to cover the county, and that's beginning to really turn the tide for us. So like everybody, we're seeing the rate fall now. We're hoping that rate will remain dropping.
Yeah, well, I was really interested to hear that you're so far down the road with the vaccinations. I was going to ask that, where people are being vaccinated, and there's a nature of the geography count against you, but clearly not. I mean, you seem to be fairly well ahead of the curve.
No, so our PCNs, our primary care networks, are doing well. And again, we're working very collaboratively in Cornwall. So we're operating shared bank, we're sharing staff across the community mental health trust, across the acute trust, and across primary care. So we're providing staff to support the vaccination with colleagues. We've got a couple of mass vaccination sites, and the PCNs are using our community hospital sites to help give out the vaccination to their groups as well. So we're pushing that through and really beginning to hit the targets that we should be to get everybody vaccinated. And again, we're vaccinating frontline staff, and those are all now easily being vaccinated. People are now preparing to start on second doses quite soon.
Well, that's great. Well done to everyone down there for doing that. That's great. And the other thing I thought was fascinating about everyone's looking at lessons learning from COVID, about the nature of the community and the population in Cornwall meant you were sort of almost protected in some ways from the virus. And in Birmingham here, still nosocomial infections are still a big problem, and that's something you've kind of by default or design have managed to achieve. So take us on then to the next step. So there's a couple of things there as we move towards integrated care. You've talked already about tremendous collaboration that exists during Cornwall, so throughout Cornwall. So let's maybe some thoughts on how much of that you'll take forward into the ICS and that model of care delivery, the community hospitals, which seem to be sort of out of fashion in a lot of places. Then maybe compare and contrast that with some of these specialised services you're going to need to provide for. I mean, I don't think there are any specialised services at all in Cornwall. I mean, there's no maternity east of Truro, is there? So, some thoughts on the development of the ICS and how you're going to you're building those services which will have to be provided out with the county.
So I think I think the COVID in lots of ways has laid a good foundation now for how the ICS will move forward in terms of getting us to work together. Just at a simplistic level, one of the things we wanted to do to stop frail elderly people pitching up at ED and running the risk of catching COVID was we opened up community assessment and treatment units, CATUs as we call them, and we opened up sort of 3 of those across Cornwall on a spine in the community hospital sites where ambulances could take people who are frail, who need some checking up, might need be off their legs as they're often described, where we can do some of the assessments where we'd have primary care. But also, the change we made was the geriatricians who were all based in RCHT in the acute sector, all of those were just, in a sense, moved out and worked within those CATUs and moved to work within a community environment at a stroke because it was the right thing to do. We didn't get into a game of, well, how do we cross-charge for that? How do we make this happen? It was just actually, if their work is now going to be based in these CATUs in community hospitals, what's the point of them being in Treliske in the acute hospital? So they were moved out just to work within a community setting. So that kind of, let's think about where the patients are and deliver, I think is at the heart of where we want our ICS to go. And one of the real positives that we're hoping we'll build upon as we move into an ICS. We got designated in terms of being an ICS back in November of last year, as the SRO sort of leading that work to get us accredited as an ICS. There was a lot of making sure we could work together, making sure we had our clear plans and our clear vision. And again, we're a unique ICS in lots of ways, as people might say. Remembering that we've got water on 3 sides and the River Tamar on the 4th. We are only a population of 500,000, so for lots of places, that is the population of place, not a full ICS. But remembering that we're 70 miles long from one end of the county to another, it takes 2 hours to drive across Cornwall. So it's that balance between, if you do it just on pure weight of numbers, as opposed to geography, it's very difficult to work through. So we've managed to convince everybody that Cornwall is the right footprint for our ICS, and that's one of the things we've taken through. And what we want to do now is build almost on the success of the joint working with COVID. I think one of the things we learned through COVID that we want to build into the ICS as we go forward is really the value of the care sector inside of all of this, that actually, if we didn't have the care sector up and functioning well, and we didn't see them as an important part of the partnership, then we were going to fail as the NHS. And I think that's, lots of people have picked that up, but I think we clearly in Cornwall, that was something that we picked up, and we were supporting the care sector. I led for PPE in Cornwall, and part of our work was getting some of the emergency supplies, some of the supplies out of the NHS supply chain to give to our colleagues in the care sector who were struggling to get PPE. Now, if they all went down with COVID and the care homes closed or the home care wasn't available, we would have immense problems. So I think, again, COVID has opened our eyes to the ICS needs to be broader than just some of the NHS partners. It needs to be those providers that deliver the care sector as well to take that through. Where we've got to with our ICS, I think like many, we've now seen the white paper. We'll wait to see what that translates to in terms of law, but we'll all wait with bated breath. But we're going out to advert now for a formal ICS leader. We're hoping to interview that on April the 12th, and by the summer have that ICS leader in place. And at the same time, as providers in Cornwall, we're looking to rationalise that down, and we're working through the process of integrating both the Community and Mental Health Trust and the Acute Trust into one organisation, so that actually you have a large NHS provider in Cornwall who's then got the scope and the ability to deliver services locally. And the drive for that is about trying to deliver services more locally and more within what we call our IC areas, within the locality, rather than rather than having everybody go in to a central acute hospital, how do we downsize the acute hospital, make PCNs our real working group, and deliver as much of the services that we want to within that environment? The analogy I would always use in this kind of approach that we're trying to take through is back in the 1980s, when I trained as a mental health nurse, our program there was to close the institutions and move people to be supported and treated out in the community. I think where we need to get to with some of our acute colleagues is large parts of their services need to now move out of the acute hospital and be delivered locally. We don't need to have ophthalmology delivered in an acute hospital. We don't do much diabetes care now in the acute hospital. It's done in community. How much more really is the acute hospital needed as a building? It needs to be there for major trauma and for crisis work, but actually for the rest of it, we're trying to look now through our ICS how we deliver that locally through our PCN catchments.
That's great, really interesting, Phil. Thanks, and a really good model actually. And in some ways, it's maybe slightly simpler with I think you bringing those organisations together in Cornwall is a bit easier than some geographies. Just maybe finally, just a word about some of the care you're not going to be able to deliver in Cornwall. I mean, you'll have waiting lists backing up, people waiting for the high volume stuff for cataracts, knees and hips, and then thinking about some of the specialist stuff you're probably not going to want to deliver in Cornwall. How are you going to cater for that provision of care under the ICS model?
So I think with the ICS, the issue for us there is how do we operate as provider collaboratives on a broader footprint than our ICS? So in terms of specialist services at the moment, for specialist secure mental health services, we're part of a collaborative that covers the whole of the Southwest for secure mental health inpatient activity. Now, I think as we move into the world of ICSs, is there going to be a different collaborative and different collaboratives in a different way? One of the things we've talked at is, so if you think about heart and cardiac work, are we going to also, as well as being an ICS, be in a collaborative that might be involve the services in Truro and RCHT, and a collaborative with Derriford in Plymouth, which is our tertiary centre, but also potentially with Imperial, so you've got that super specialist loop. And those provider collaboratives, I think, are going to be part of the overlay and the integration that we're going to have to provide some of that more specialist approach that actually will do as much as we can in Cornwall, but there's always going to be bits that are outside of that. And those provider collaboratives and clearer pathways will be the way that I expect the ICS will operate to cover that off.
That's great. It's really interesting. I think it's the one thing we're all really interested to see develop is what those different provider collaboratives will be like. And as we know, always the NHS has been many things, but it's never been national, probably never will be. And you will necessarily look different from Birmingham, where provider collaborative is pretty obvious, and you've got a big enough population to provide that full range of specialised services. It has to look different from your arrangements down on the Southwest Peninsula there. So that's been, Phil, that's been really, really interesting. Look, we must do this again. As the ICS kicks in, and just and pick up this conversation maybe again in a year or so. In the meantime, well, congratulations on everything you've done down there. I'm really pleased to hear the vaccinations are flying out, and some great lessons, I think, for all of us in terms of collaboration, but also that out of hospital element, which is a huge part of the long-term plan and a huge part of the white paper. So thanks for sharing your thoughts with us today, Phil.
Good to speak to you, Richard. Bye.